how do they prevent it from coming to that point? They tried to scare the Europeans. The firing of the Oreshnik into Lviv last week was the military equivalent of Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, nominally the deputy secretary of the State Security Council, sending off one of his tweets saying how Russia has all these massive weapons. We will take on Europe. We will defeat you if you mess with us. Do I think the Oreshnik was successful in breaking European support for Ukraine? No. Do I think it was successful in getting Donald Trump to tell Europe that it cannot support Ukraine? No. So as on so many occasions so far, even though the threat to Ukraine is still severe in other respects, the firing of this Oreshnik failed.
Scott Lucas is professor of international politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to our program, Professor Lucas.
Hello, Daniel. It's good to see you today.
My pleasure, likewise. Thanks. And I would like to begin our discussion with this attack on Ukraine. Russia launched an Oreshnik missile inside Ukraine overnight into Friday, the second time since the full-scale war began in 2022. This strike comes after a series of setbacks for Moscow. US-sized Russian-flagged tanker, US forces captured Nicolas Maduro. Also, US, UK, France have agreed to provide Ukraine with solid security guarantees and also to deploy some troops to Ukraine. Is this strike a sign of Vladimir Putin's desperation?
I think the Oreshnik strike is... Look, when you have a bully and you push back against the bully doesn't want to say, oh, I'm going to quit. I'm going to stop attacking. The bully tries to pretend that he's even tougher than you are. So as Ukraine, with support from Europe and possibly getting some US support as it bolsters its resistance, Vladimir Putin says, well, how am I going to stop this? Oh, I'll show them how tough I really am. Now, I don't want to minimize Russia's missile and drone strikes over the past week. In terms of the cruise missile strikes, ballistic missiles, just drones, they have been very, very serious. As you and I speak, Kyiv, which was attacked overnight, Thursday into Friday, there are still quite a few apartment blocks, quite a few residences that are without power. But in the case of the Oreshnik, which was fired at an area that you know well, Daniel, near Lviv, in western Ukraine, this was more of a demonstration attack. The Oreshnik, of course, is a hypersonic, intermediate range ballistic missile. And for those of us who grew up during the Cold War and, IRBMs, especially IRBMs that could fly that fast, that's very, very scary, very, very frightening. But in this case, the Oreshnik wasn't flown as much to cause serious damage as much as it was to say, look, we can do this. Because the Oreshnik is also nuclear capable. We can't fire this missile, and who knows what it'll have on it next time. And why Lviv? Why Western Ukraine? Because you're about 60 kilometers from the Polish border, a member of NATO. The same NATO which has been stepping up its support of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin's tactics during the full-scale invasion since February 2022 have been to try to divide Europe away from Ukraine and to try to divide the US from Europe. Yet as we went into last week, he was failing. His attempt in late October, working with the Trump envoys, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, to hand an ultimatum to Ukraine, give up all of the Donetsk region, keep the rest of the country militarily weak, politically weak, make it in effect a country which has been split and which cannot act unless I say so. That ultimatum had failed. Not only had Witkoff and Kushner stopped pressing it, they were talking to the Europeans and Ukraine in Berlin and in Paris about a document by Ukraine and Europe which would provide security guarantees to Kyiv with U.S. participation. European troops, UK and France, inside Ukraine to help Ukrainian forces maintain a ceasefire on the front line. The U.S. to lead the air support to make sure Russia did not carry out its missile, its drone, its warplane threats. Now that document still has to be confirmed and worked out. There are details such as the length of the security guarantee. There are details such as the exact status of the Donetsk region, whether it will be a demilitarized free economic zone. There are details such as the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and who controls it. But here, rather than the Kremlin telling Ukraine, you must do this, you have the prospect of Ukraine and Europe with the United States going to the Kremlin and saying, here is our plan, do you agree to that? And we know that the Kremlin doesn't want to agree to it. We know they don't want to agree to security guarantees for Ukraine. We know they don't want to agree to a ceasefire. We know they don't want to agree to having only the territory they occupy. They want more territory, Donetsk. So how do they prevent it from coming to that point? They tried to scare the Europeans. The firing of the Oreshnik into Lviv last week was the military equivalent of Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, nominally the deputy secretary of the State Security Council, sending off one of his tweets saying how Russia has all these massive weapons. We will take on Europe. We will defeat you if you mess with us. Do I think the Oreshnik was successful in breaking European support for Ukraine? No. Do I think it was successful in getting Donald Trump to tell Europe that it cannot support Ukraine? No. So as on so many occasions so far, even though the threat to Ukraine is still severe in other respects, the firing of this Oreshnik failed.
You just mentioned about the reasons behind this decision to fire Oreshnik missile. According to Bloomberg, Russia was irritated by US-Ukraine progress on security guarantees and also had a small window to act given its growing economic problems. And according to Bloomberg, that's why Vladimir Putin would decide to fire Oreshnik missile into Ukraine. What is your take on that? And do you feel that this decision just emboldened European nations to support Ukraine even more? This missile was without the payload. Isn't it a joke?
Well, no, because it wasn't a joke what they were doing, because when you have a demonstration strike, it's not whether or not you have a payload on it. It's could we put a payload on the next Oreshnik that we fire at you? And in particular, if you have UK and French forces who will not be on the front lines, they will not be on the ceasefire line, they will be far back from the front lines, could Russia fire an Oreshnik with a payload at a position where the UK and French troops are, right? Could they fire the Oreshnik with a payload close to a border with Poland? That's the reason why it was sent across. I do think to talk about the Bloomberg article, I think it is right to mention the economic issues that are here. And we've talked about it on, I think, almost all of our programs, that there are the growing economic constraints that could limit Russia's invasion. In this case, I don't think it was the economic issue that really led to this. It was the political issue. It was the political security issue that led to this occurring. Now, once again, European reaction to this simply was to come out quite firmly and forcefully in coordinated statements to condemn the firing of the Oreshnik. Because what has become important here, is not only about European support for Ukraine, which of course is the priority, it's also European support for those members of NATO that are closest to Russia. You cannot have Poland being under this type of threat do what Moscow says, or somehow you might get attacked. You can't have the Baltic states under the threat of this. And so we just have another chapter in the story that since February 2022 in the full-scale invasion, Vladimir Putin, every time he has made a threat, it has only led to Europe taking steps to strengthen its defense, not to pull back from that. When he made the threats in 2022, when he carried out the invasion, Finland and Sweden joined NATO. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, their profile within Europe, within NATO, within the European Union increased. When he carried out sabotage operations, threatened to detonate packages, including on aircraft, when they went in with drone and fighter jet overflights, Europe did not pull back. It doubled down on saying we have to bolster our defense against those overflights. We have to bolster our defense against that sabotage. When the Russians went in to try to tear up Polish railways, Europe supported Poland in terms of that this act was unacceptable, and Europe would respond fully through legal processes and through preparation, defense preparation, security preparations to make sure that Russia didn't succeed.
That also covers the New York Times article about Vladimir Putin's silence on the fall of Maduro, on the seizure of Russian tankers linked to the Russian state, and on the security guarantees. According to the New York Times, Vladimir Putin has said nothing about these developments, and Putin's war against Ukraine has limited Russian power abroad, because Russia has lost Syria, has probably lost Nicolas Maduro, several oil tankers, and also this tanker in the Atlantic. Moreover, according to Reuters, Russian Navy was trying to secure the tanker, to save this tanker, to prevent US forces from seizing this tanker. However, they failed. And why did Vladimir Putin say nothing about this?
What could the Russians do? As much as I dislike the Trump administration's approach, including the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, a head of state, seizing a tanker which was in international waters after pursuing it for almost 2 weeks, as much as I could talk to you about how this threatens to shatter international law, in this case, might makes the law, and might makes the situation. And that is that Venezuela is thousands of miles away from Russia. The Russians have certainly provided a lot of military equipment to Venezuela, but they don't have that many advisors in Venezuela, and they don't want to get those advisors killed, as the Cubans did. So, what exactly are you going to do when the Americans decide they're going to enforce a 21st century version of the Monroe Doctrine? You have to pull back. When then several days later, the Bella 1, renamed the Marinero, which was on its way to Venezuela to pick up oil, never actually made it to the Venezuelan port, turned around, fled across the North Atlantic. When the Americans finally caught up to it south of Iceland, despite the fact that the Russians had said, we have a submarine nearby, we have vessels monitoring this, when the Americans went ahead anyway, what are the Russians going to do? Are they going to actually challenge the U.S. naval power? And again, no, because that would raise the stakes. That would raise the confrontation. We've talked so often about how Donald Trump has aided and appeased and helped Vladimir Putin throughout this full-scale invasion. And that's certainly true. But this was one occasion where, because the priority of Trump and his inner circle was, we get to decide what happens with Venezuela. We get to decide what happens with the ships connected with Venezuela, even if they've been reflagged as Russian. Then this was a case where Donald Trump wasn't going to help Putin. And it just showed the lines on Russian power. It showed the lines on Russian military power, that they can't afford a direct confrontation with the United States. And it showed the lines on Russia's political and economic power, as you mentioned. The question is how far this can go. Because as I speak to you right now, I'm just going to add something else in the mix. And that is that a country that I've covered for many years, in fact, going back to 2009, Iran, You've got mass protests right now across the country that are challenging the legitimacy of the regime. Now, I don't necessarily think they'll topple the regime, but I do think it's weakening the regime. And of course, Iran, that Iranian regime, is another one of the few outlets that the Russians have to try to break their international isolation. So, what happens if they lose a country in Iran that has been instrumental in their drone efforts, has helped Russia with missile development, and has been instrumental economically in propping up Russia throughout this invasion?
You just mentioned about this global events, breaking news from around the globe. It's probably Vladimir Putin has lost Syria, Nicolas Maduro, and can lose also Iran. Don't you think that the global balance of power is shifting not in favor of Russia right now?
Yeah, the one caveat I put this is we don't have a balance of power. We've got complete chaos in the global order. And I think we need to be honest with this. As much as you and I might like the fact that Russia is weaker and it helps Ukraine, there is a wider picture here, which is that the international system as we've known it since 1945 is being shattered. It's being shattered because there is no longer international law that will be observed by certain countries. It's not observed by Vladimir Putin. And ironically, it's not observed by the Trump administration, or at least Donald Trump and his key advisors. We have got a system in which Vladimir Putin does not respect alliances. He doesn't respect NATO. He might fear it, but he doesn't respect it, that it should exist. He doesn't really respect the United Nations. He tends to abuse it. But the Trump camp don't respect the international alliances either. There are no more alliances between the Trump folks and Europe. There are certain cases where they will cooperate because there's still people in the Trump administration that still want to defend Ukraine and European security, like Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, like military officials, like intelligence officials. But Trump and his inner circle do not believe in an alliance with the European Union. And they don't even believe in an alliance with individual European governments. Some of them they're trying to topple. A story I can talk to you about on another video cast. In terms of what's happening in the Middle East, we have a whole series of cases that operate without international law, that operate beyond alliances at this point, and that operate beyond stability. That's true of Israel and Palestine, including Gaza. That is true of Yemen. That could well be true of Iran. So I think we need to have eyes open here. There was a telling statement which Vladimir Zelensky made in response to the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro. And quite clearly, Zelensky was not going to criticize the United States for kidnapping Maduro. So what he said was, well, if they're going to kidnap Maduro, we've got another proposal for them, which is, go in and lift Vladimir Putin out of the Kremlin, which exposed the fact that we really don't have international order here. Because on the one hand, the Americans could go into Venezuela and defy international law, defy the sovereignty of Venezuela, and they could seize Maduro, whereas Vladimir Putin, who has been effectively served with an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court, who the ICC want to try for the crime of seizing, abducting Ukrainian children, and yet no one's going to go in and kidnap him, right? And indeed, just to highlight the risk of this, that even if we might cheer that this has weakened Russia, realize the precedent that this set with Maduro, which is that you can go in and you can kidnap, you can even kill a head of state without respect to a country's sovereignty. Vladimir Putin has been trying to kill Vladimir Zelensky at least since February 2022. He's been trying to capture him, of course. Now, so far, he hasn't succeeded. But if, heaven forbid, Vladimir Putin ever captured Vladimir Zelensky or killed him, he will use the rationale that under Russian law, Zelensky could be kidnapped or killed, that this is absolutely legitimate. And if someone says, well, you can't do that, you can't take the head of state of a neighboring country, Putin can say, well, the United States did it in Venezuela, so why not me?
Let's also cover another interesting development. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has reached its milestone, now lasting longer rather than Soviet Union's war against the Nazi Germany during the Second World War. While the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany, ultimately Russia has failed to break Ukraine, to break Ukrainian resistance. What is your take on this grim milestone of the war, and can Vladimir Putin sell any kind of victory to Russians in case of he is forced to agree with ceasefire deal?
Well, it certainly is one record the Kremlin is not celebrating, to say the least. I mean, I found it interesting because I think it was January 7th. So this would have been an Orthodox Christmas ceremony in Russia, that Putin, who has not been seen with his family for many years, and he shows up alongside military officials all decked out in their uniforms and their families, right? So here was this message, for Christmas, not as much about Jesus or not as much about God. It was about our military, our homeland, right? Let's light a candle for it. Well, here we are several days later, and here's this milestone that shows you that the world's second largest military has spent almost 4 years in a full-scale invasion, coming up to the 4th anniversary, and it hasn't won, hasn't succeeded. And it doesn't matter how many ceremonies Putin has with the military, doesn't matter how many times he talks about the special military operation, that's your fact. Ukraine still stands. So again, the fact that we're talking about going into a 5th year, longer than the Soviet effort against Nazi Germany, it just shows the fact that Russia is not as strong as Putin wants to portray. Now, does that mean that Russia is weak and vulnerable? I don't know. I don't know if Putin can stay in power. I don't know how long the economy will last. But what I can say is I think we're probably getting to a moment where Russia needs to see something decisive, in terms of either breaking Ukraine by breaking its energy infrastructure once and for all, or it needs to have a breakthrough on the front lines, say in Donetsk, possibly Zaporizhia, or it needs to finally break international support for Ukraine. Well, it's not breaking international support for Ukraine, and it's not even breaking American support for Ukraine completely. It's not breaking through on the front lines, and you're still speaking to me, despite all those Russian missile and drone attacks, albeit from Lviv. And even as people in Kyiv are trying to get power restored, Ukraine isn't giving up. So it'll be interesting to see when the next milestone comes up. And I'm trying to think when it would be. I think, the reason why the Soviet Union marks their great patriotic war as being just under 4 years in World War II is because, of course, for the first 2 years of that actual war, they were allied with Nazi Germany in 1939 to 1941. But it would be interesting that, again, heaven forbid, if we ever get a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine that lasts longer than World War II in its entirety, if you mark that as being from the invasion of Poland in September 1939 to the surrender of Germany in June 45. I wonder how Vladimir will celebrate that.
That's really interesting question you just asked. And from your perspective, does Putin have an end game right now, right? He just reached this milestone, longer than Soviet Union's war against Nazi Germany, right?
Yeah. His end game is to win. I mean, that's it. It's still the same end game as in February 2022 with some modifications. I mean, the end game in February 2022 was to install a puppet government in Kyiv, probably under Mr. Medvedchuk. It was to capture, probably kill President Zelensky and his ministers. It was to force Ukrainians to accept that puppet government. And even if they had a nominal independence, they would be ruled by Moscow. Well, what is the end game now? He cannot capture or kill Zelensky and his ministers, it appears. He cannot install a puppet government in Kyiv. So the end game is to seize as much territory as possible and to keep the rest of Ukraine weak. That even if you have a government which he doesn't dictate, even if Ukrainians get to choose their government, that government is limited in terms of its military. It is limited in terms of its assistance that it receives from other countries for its military. It is limited in terms of its foreign policy. It has to not only be neutral, it actually has to accept constraints set by Moscow. And it has to have an economy, which to some extent, even if you say in principle Ukraine could try to join the EU, Moscow can make certain demands on it. And meanwhile, Russia will try to subvert the rest of Ukraine, as it has tried to do in Moldova, and as it's tried to do in other countries, by undermining the elections. That's the end game. But at this point, again, because of the defeat of that ultimatum that Russia worked out with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, we're not at a point where that end game looks like it has any chance of success. I think we need to prepare ourselves for the next steps here, which is if the Ukraine-Europe-U.S. proposals are finally confirmed, and that includes proposals on reconstruction of Ukraine as well, as the security guarantees. It includes the proposals on Ukraine's political status. And when they're presented to the Kremlin and the Kremlin rejects them, Putin's end game will still be, I have to keep attacking. What is the end game for Ukraine and Europe at that point? How can they finally get Putin boxed in where he has to give up his end game and where he has to accept a ceasefire on the basis of the front lines?
Let's also cover next President Zelensky moves. President Zelensky probably will meet with US President Donald Trump next week or on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Switzerland, in Davos. According to Axios, President Zelensky would probably agree this security guarantees package with President Trump and reconstruction package. What is your assessment of the upcoming diplomatic engagement with President Trump?
Well, that's going to be for show. I mean, let's be honest here. What matters here is there going to be the discussions leading up to Davos. Have you got those documents in order? The one thing that's being floated, again, probably by Trump officials, is, there will be an $800 billion reconstruction economic development agreement that will be signed. Clearly, the Americans will want something where they can take profits out of Ukraine, rare earth minerals, et cetera. But the fundamental here is going to be how developed is that security guarantee that they supposedly agree to? And there are certain issues that are still out there. We still need clarity on the extent of the European force that's going to work inside Ukraine. We know that it's primarily UK and France at this point, but there are issues in terms of how many troops the UK can contribute. We need to know if any other countries might join that. We need details on the US-led air support that'll probably be based in Poland. We need details on Donetsk in terms of its status. You can't just keep it in this area of, like, this gray area between, is it occupied? Is it Ukrainian territory in part? Is it demilitarized? You have to define this. And if you don't define that, the problem is that Davos might come up with certain statements where people say, we intend to cooperate on these documents, but as unpredictable and as chaotic Trump is, it could be undone. So now I think as much as the cameras will be on it, Zelensky and Trump at Davos, it's what happens in the rooms where the cameras aren't over the next few days that are going to be important.
From your perspective, how the Russians already commented on this idea? I mean, how they gave their answer to President Trump, whether they support or accept or reject this offer to end the war?
Oh, they say this publicly all the time. I mean, they always threaten. Oh, look, they threaten, we will never accept European forces inside Ukraine. And then what do? They fire the Oreshnik to drive the point home. So they didn't have to tell Trump through a secret message They're publicly saying, we're not going to accept this. They have publicly rejected any notion of a ceasefire in Donetsk. The special military operation must continue. So, even though Trump is not the sharpest tool in the box, I think he probably should realize right now that he isn't going to get a peace deal from the Russians. And indeed, that's why he's increasingly frustrated with them. And once again, Trump has swung in the past few days. Instead of criticizing Ukraine and criticizing President Zelensky, he's gone back to criticizing Putin and the Russians. Doesn't mean that he's going to give full support for Ukraine, but it does give more space for Ukraine and Europe to work with those Americans who are the adults in the room to try to lock down the details of the documents. I've got to give you the fundamental here, and that is that we're not talking peace deal here. What we're talking about is the arrangements to make Ukraine as strong and as secure as possible until Putin finally gives up. That's what we're looking at.
That also covers most nuanced statement from President Trump about President Zelensky. Trump just recently, during the interview with New York Times, said, quote, well, Zelensky doesn't have the cards. He didn't have the cards from the day one. However, Trump says that President Zelensky has just only one card, and this card is Donald Trump.
Oh, that interview with the New York Times was just crazy. That was just Trump craziness. And I can give you all kinds of bizarre things. I'll give you one example of how crazy it was away from Ukraine. Trump actually told the New York Times that in 2020, after he lost the election to Joe Biden, he should have ordered the seizure of the voting machines, that the National Guard should have seized the voting machines, right? So this was effectively an interview where Trump was being an authoritarian and bragging about it, right? So when you have someone bragging about an authoritarian, every other leader is weak. Every other leader is weak. They all love him and they all respect his power. So those comments, and he's made that comment about Zelensky before, he doesn't have the cards, right? And we know the Ukraine and Europe response is, well, here's our cards right here. And then he says, yeah, the one card is that Zelensky's got me. In other words, Zelensky should go and pay tribute to him. That was just Trump shooting off his mouth. And again, I don't want to underestimate how damaging Trump is and how damaging he is with his instability, his chaos, his unpredictability. But that New York Times interview, to me, was white noise. As I just mentioned a few minutes ago, what I'm looking at is, are we making significant progress on the documents which cover security guarantees, reconstruction, economic development, Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, status of territory? Are we making progress on air defenses? Are we making progress on support of Ukraine for attacks inside Russia, which is where we just had an interesting announcement from the UK about their development of a new missile? Are we making progress on those fronts? That's what matters to me, not Donald Trump's long-winded thought bubbles, because I will add something else to you. And we need to realize that you have to look beyond Trump. You have to look at other officials. J.D. Vance, who is hostile. Steve Witkoff, who is simply weak. Jared Kushner, who's in it for economic interest. Marco Rubio, who I think is someone who will work with Europe. You have to look beyond those. You have to look at those officials because Donald Trump is declining. Donald Trump has got some serious health issues working there. I've watched him very carefully, especially over the last few weeks, and he is not functioning well in public. He's slurring, he's rambling, he doesn't stick to the point, he's falling asleep in meetings. He is the combination of a wannabe authoritarian who is not all there. And that makes the real risk for Ukraine, not what Trump does, but how Trump can undo what is happening simply because he can't stay on script. He can't actually stick to a decision which he has made or which others are making.
And final question for you. Why does President Trump want to have Greenland, and can he obtain secure Greenland without destroying NATO?
Because Donald Trump likes stuff. He likes to take stuff. As a businessman, he always liked to take stuff, whether it was legal or not. as a president, he's like, I would like to have the oil from Venezuela, so I'm going to kidnap the president. I would like to have the oil from Iraq. Not going to be able to get that for the moment. I would like to have the oil from Iran. I would like to have the Panama Canal. I would like to have Greenland. He just wants stuff. He has other advisors around him, however. And again, you got to look beyond Trump, where this is very serious. You have the Vice President, J.D. Vance, who not only does not believe in a U.S. alliance with Europe, he actually is hostile to the European Union and to European countries. So J.D. Vance does not want Greenland to be part of Denmark. He wants to seize it. You have Pete Hegseth, who is the defense secretary, who just wants for the U.S. to look tough. You have Donald Trump Jr. and other people close to the president who want to make money out of Greenland. And that does include rare earth minerals. Now, does that mean that they will go to war? Listen to what I'm saying. Does that mean they will go to war with another member of NATO? Because if they use military force against Greenland, as the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, has made clear, this is the end of NATO. Will they do that? I don't think so at this point. I think Trump uses the tactics of threatening military action, all options on the table, because he's a bully. And he's trying to bully the Danes into talks to give up Greenland. Well, the Danes aren't going to be bullied by that. Equally important, people in Greenland, even if they want independence, do not want to be part of the United States. There will be a meeting this week between Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and Danish Foreign Minister and Danish officials. And there, I hope we get some sanity back in the discussions. The U.S. can make an economic proposal. It can make an economic proposal regarding Greenland, but it is up to Denmark and Greenland in terms of whether or not they accept that proposal. I think what some Trump officials want to do is they want to split Greenland off. They want it to become independent, and then they can offer what's called a compact of free association. That means the U.S. will get priority economic access. It will be responsible for the foreign and defense policy of Greenland. But even if Greenland became independent, where you could do that, Greenland might not accept that. So I think in this case, the Trump folks sometimes are like a dog chasing a parked car. Yap, 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 yap. And sometimes they get up to the parked car. This is what happened in Venezuela. They got rid of Nicolas Maduro. They kidnapped Nicolas Maduro, but then it was like, well, wait, what are we going to do next? How are we going to take the oil? Well, they've left the Maduro government or Maduro regime in place. They're still going to have to deal with that. With Greenland, yap, 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 yap. We can take Greenland. Well, even if you get a chance to discuss, to try to take Greenland, how exactly are you going to do that? And I don't think they have options. So I realize why this is making headlines. But if I could give you the really serious story, because it comes back to Ukraine, it's not Greenland. It's the fact that you have certain Trump administration officials who don't want to be part of NATO. They want to break up the European Union, as they say in their national security strategy. They want to put far-right governments in power in Europe, white nationalist governments, including in Germany with the AfD. They want to put the hard right Reform Party in power in the UK. So the real threat that we're talking about here is not that they seize Greenland with military force. It's that through political, economic, and propaganda measures that they destabilize all of Europe, undermine the European Union, and undermine the European governments who have been so important for maintaining support of Ukraine's resistance.
Thank you, Professor Lucas, for this another in-depth discussion and for your analysis, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Thank you so much, Daniel.